Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Howard Brenton's play Anne Boleyn, which, as you might reasonably guess, tries to make sense of the complex historical figure of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, the woman for whom he founded the Church of England, more or less. She's a very difficult figure. There's a lot of competing interpretations of Anne Boleyn, what her role in history is, what type of person she was, etc., etc. And one of the things that's cool about Brenton's play is it not only is interested in Anne in herself, but in what we make of her. So this is a historiographic play. Now, one thing prefatory to this, many of you will know, long-term viewers of the channel will know, I love history plays, and so Anne Boleyn is right in there. But I also happened to be on a study abroad trip in 2010 when this play premiered at London's Globe Theatre, and so I actually got to see the opening run. It is a really, really cool play to see put on. It's also just a really good play in its own right for readers as well. So, the play actually starts with Anne. She gives us, it's not the prologue, because it's Act 1, Scene 1, but it works like a prologue. Basically, she is introduced. It says, "Enter Anne Boleyn in her blood-stained execution dress. She has a large embroidered bag with her." And she basically starts out by teasing the audience, asking if we want to see it, by which we're supposed to mean her severed head. But then she pulls out, and she goes back and forth. She's like, "Yeah, I'll show you." "No, I'm not going to show you. I know why you want to see it, but no, I'm not going to show you." "All right, I'll show you." So she goes back and forth. And this introduces this sort of idea of Anne as a tease, not necessarily just in the sexual sense, although that definitely is part of her relationship with Henry VIII, but she's a tease in the sense that she knows how to flirt, she knows how to work an audience, she knows how to engage with people and hook their interest, to get them in some way invested in what she's doing. So this idea is introduced right from the beginning of the play. But then, when she finally pulls it out, it's not her severed head. The first thing she pulls out of this bag is her Bible. And so this is one of the other big components of this play, is Anne's role in the Protestant Reformation and the formation of the Church of England. There is a lot of dispute about this. Because again, some people see Anne Boleyn very much in the terms that her opponents at Henry's court saw her, as this sort of scheming whore who was maybe in league with the devil, trying to destroy the monarchy, destroy Henry, destroy England, whatever it was. Some people see her as a kind of Protestant martyr almost. And some people believe that she played a major role in promoting to Henry VIII the works of a guy named William Tinsdale, who was regarded by the Catholic Church, and actually also, I think, by the Lutherans, as a heretic. His works were banned, including his translation of the New Testament, maybe? I don't know if he translated the whole Bible. But his translation was banned. His book, The Devotion of a Christian Man, I think is the name of it. I don't remember what exactly it is. But his books were banned. They were subject to being burnt. And Anne probably read them. I think. So Brenton talks about this. I don't know enough about her sort of personal religious history to confirm the historicity of this, but supposedly she had copies of Tinsdale's Bible and his other book that she had annotated herself. So clearly she had read them. But then it's The Observance of a Christian Man. That's the name of the book, the other book. But then The Observance of a Christian Man was probably one of the texts that influenced Henry VIII, because one of the things Tinsdale was very much opposed to was the idea of the Pope as the head of the church. And so he makes the argument, based in a particular reading of Scripture, that in fact the Pope's authority is illegitimate and the church is more localized. What that localized authority looks like depends on who you ask. And that actually is one of the big religious debates of the play, particularly in the framing scenes with James I, who... So Henry's daughter, Elizabeth, reigned for 1,000 years after Henry VIII's death, and then when she died childless in 1603, 1603 or 1601. I'm pretty sure it's 1603, but I can't quite remember. Anyway, when she dies in the early 17th century, James the Sixth of Scotland becomes James the First of England. Anyway, so we get that frame story. Act 1, Scene 2 introduces James I. And James I as a king is actually one of my favorite British monarchs because he was very intellectual, but he was also very sort of crude, and he brought a rough-hewn style from the Scottish court to the much more sophisticated English court, and people in England had to sort of figure out what to do with this. But he was also a scholar who wrote multiple books and pamphlets and things like this. And, I mean, yes, he was a king, and so there's always that sort of question of, like, are people just saying his work is insightful because he's the king? But he actually was quite smart. He was quite insightful. He was wrong about many things, but, you know, we've got the benefit of 4 centuries or whatever it is since his time to sort of recognize that not everything he said was correct. But that's not the point. So James takes a major interest in Anne's life, partially because they discover a trunk that Elizabeth had been keeping with one of Anne's dresses, the dress she wore to her coronation. And then James finds a secret compartment containing the Bible and The Observance of a Christian Man. So we've got these elements where, like, James is investigating her life, and it intersects with what's going on in his life, because one of the big tensions of Henry VIII's time is religious authority. Again, this idea that, like, the Pope is an illegitimate figure starts to spread in England at this time, and Henry VIII, because he wants a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, which the Pope will not give him, because the Pope had given him special dispensation to marry Catherine in the first place, Henry finds this idea very attractive. This idea that absolute religious authority is not vested in the papacy, but is vested in the king. And so this is where the idea of the Church of England comes in. Anne is in this sort of religious mix, and we actually have a scene where she meets William Tyndale in a forest and gets from him a copy of his book. And basically she commits to trying to get Henry VIII to reform the church in England along Tyndale's principles. Later, interestingly enough, there's another scene in the forest with William Tyndale where he basically denounces Anne because he, ironically enough, buys into the scriptural interpretation of that the papacy uses. So this guy who is 100% against the Pope, uses the same logic that the Pope uses to explain why Catherine of Aragon is still Henry VIII's legitimate wife, and Anne Boleyn is therefore an adulteress with him. So we've got that sort of tension. But the thing that I think is interesting about it, or the thing that I find most interesting about it, is that this aligns with the context of the frame story. That the story that James I is living out, because by the time of James I, almost a century after these events had happened, the religious questions were still not settled. And so much of Act 2 actually does focus on James himself in his time as he's trying to manage these competing religious factions. The two big factions are the Anglicans, the Church of England, who is the official established church, and of which James is technically the head, although he probably was not an Anglican, certainly was not an Anglican prior to coming to England. He may personally have been more of a Catholic, but he was also raised among Presbyterians in Scotland who were more aligned with the Puritan faction in England. And the Puritans basically believed in streamlining the church, very, very local control, largely abolishing church hierarchy, abolishing central dogma, etc., etc. James, at first, tries to basically just order them to get along. Like he has a conference where he meets with the representatives of the Anglican Church, and he says, you're no longer allowed to persecute Puritans. Then he meets with the leaders of both, actually the Anglicans are still there, but also he brings in the Puritan leaders, and he's like, I'm giving amnesty to all Catholics who are loyal to the crown. And they're like, what? That's crazy talk. And he's like, no, you will accept it. So basically, James tries to use the authority of the king to sort of force a religious peace. And when that doesn't work, he basically says, all right, you all, the leaders of both of your factions are going to stand outside of this room, no food, no water, until you figure out how you can all play nicely together. And they come up with the idea for a new Bible, which will, as we know, become the King James Version of the Bible, sort of the authoritative English language Bible for centuries, really. And then the question becomes, okay, what is this Bible going to look like? And there's actually some really interesting bits in here where, like James is asking them these questions about how they would translate particular words. So the Greek ecclesia, for instance, is used in a particular sense in the Greek Bible, which is the original version of the Bible. The New Testament was written in Greek originally. So James says, how will you translate the Greek word ecclesia? Andrews, who's the representative of the Anglican faction, says church. Reynolds, leading the Puritans, says congregation. And so James points out that these are massive differences. These two words do not mean the same thing. They don't convey the same idea. The same thing, he asks them how to translate presbyteros. Andrew says priest. Reynolds says elder. Agape, one of the most famous phrases, faith, hope, and in Greek it would be agape. Andrews, for the Anglican, says charity. Reynolds says love. And so these are very different answers. So this becomes the interesting sort of meta-historical component of this play, that religious tension continues, and the way that Anne is understood to signify remains important for how people negotiate religious tensions to this day, or to James's day at least. But because this is also premiering in 2010, it is still of relevance to us. It is still of interest to us. I mean, the role of the Anglican Church in the UK remains extremely significant, but the UK is also now a very religiously diverse place. You have large Jewish populations, you have large Catholic populations, you have large Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, you have large populations of all of these Muslims, you have large populations of all of these different world religions. And so what it means to be British for centuries involved being part of the Church of England. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. And so I think Brenton is doing this really interesting thing where by bringing Anne into the time of James and having James trying to figure out what Anne Boleyn means for him, it raises questions for the audience about both what Anne means for us and about what James means for us, or people in the UK, if you want to maybe be pedantic.